All right, we're going to get started. Cheryl. My name's David Hunter. I'm a professor here at American University. It's nice to be part of the great 2 days that have been going on. This is a panel on EPA's role in international affairs, particularly capacity building. What we've done, what are we doing, what have we learned, what should the future look like for EPA's capacity building and skill sharing around the world. It's a great joy for me personally to participate in this panel, as it brought me back to pretty much the beginning of my international work when I was in Central and Eastern Europe. And I have the unique perspective of, in some ways, being a recipient of EPA's capacity building, because I was representing the Czech and Slovak, then Czechoslovakia, as they received aid from the US EPA. And I can say from that perspective that when we say EPA is viewed as the gold standard and that it's recognized as a leader around the world, that it was certainly true then and there. We're joined by a great group panel. We're going to start with Ruth Greenspan Bell, Public Policy Fellow at Environmental Change and Security Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And then we'll be joined by Timothy Epp, Acting Director, National FOIA Office and Assistant General Counsel for International Law at EPA. Then Scott Fulton, President of the Environmental Law Institute, who's been a great partner with EPA. Previously, Mr. Fulton was a partner at Beveridge and Diamond and has held virtually every position at EPA: General Counsel, Deputy Administrator, and Head of EPA's Office of International Affairs. And then Dale Medeiros, Senior Environmental Planner at Northern Virginia Regional Commission, former Program Manager for Europe, EPA Office of International Affairs, will give us a perspective of what international looks like from the local level. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ruth.
Is this on? I have to press something. Okay. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity, and thank you particularly to Amanda. I'm not sure she's in this room, but I'm very appreciative. My own career, and in fact my entire life, changed because EPA was committed to sharing our expertise internationally. So I'm going to start with this story, which I think illustrates the potential of EPA's international role, at least through my experience. I was Assistant General Counsel in the Office of General Counsel when, largely because of my husband's career, we decided as a family to move to Poland in early 1991. My entire professional focus had been domestic. Our wonderful then career Deputy General Counsel, Jerry Yamada, assured me that I would have the same job to come back to. But then he said, if you find something interesting to do there, we will support you. I frankly had no idea, for the most part, what EPA did internationally. Jerry handed me a blank check to fill out as I wished, and those of you who worked in the agency know how unusual that was. Usually every job had a pre-written job description. Poland was emerging from the Soviet bloc. They had environmental laws on the books, but it was pretty much of a Potemkin village. There was no consistent compliance. Laws had been selectively enforced. Fines were built into the budgets of state-owned industries. The exciting part was that the whole society was trying to make radical change on every level. David Hunter and Margaret Bowman were living in Prague, doing very similar work. They came to visit us in Warsaw, and together we ordered takeout pizza, something that had not yet hit Prague. So we were showing, Warsaw's advanced state off to the folks living in Prague. By the time we returned to Washington, I was helping Poland integrate environmental issues, principally the potential of Superfund-like liabilities, into their high-priority privatization of nationally owned industries. Along with a Polish-American colleague, I was the first to brief the Polish environment minister on this important set of issues. I was working with the Regional Environmental Center in Budapest on a variety of projects from privatization through environmental public participation. Later, an EPA team, including amazing enforcement expertise, helped Poland think about implementing a wider range of enforcement tools. Before that, they had only fines and the nuclear option, which was shutting down industry, A several-year project helped them think about alternatives like compliance schedules, which was totally new to them. And what made it particularly fun and interesting was thinking about how to translate from our common law tradition, where doing something like that was pretty easy, to the context of their civil law system. This set the course for my career since then. So to the point of the conference today, what does EPA have to offer the world? You'll hear today about reframing international environmental engagement in terms of ideas the world can offer us. And that's a mature recognition of the reality of a world that can be a lab, sharing ideas, developing ideas, and sharing them as environmental protection matures. But there are many places on this earth where we still must pay attention to fundamentals, where the culture of compliance that we rely on here in the United States just simply doesn't exist, where laws can be still can be called aspirational. In other words, there's little expectation that the standards will or can be met. They're nice thoughts on paper, not so much in real life. This experience forced me as an American lawyer to think hard about the purpose and meaning of environmental laws, how they're implemented, the assumptions on which they rest. What makes them work? Is it enforcement? Or is it a deeper set of joint assumptions about the function and importance of law in a society? Almost every country we worked in had laws on the books. In Russia, we worked with environmental law experts who were expert on the cutting-edge approaches in the mature environmental countries. They came home, excuse me, to incorporate these ideas in Soviet laws. But in the Soviet period, laws were not generally published. You had to have a need to know to get your hands on them. So when things change in a society like that, what is the meaning of law? How do you restore the eroded public trust? Did that trust ever exist? What did people actually think was the purpose of laws? And in many parts of the world, there's no history of a law-based society as we know it here. Laws are, in the best case, a kind of a consensus document about societal goals and ways to achieve them. They must command public respect. They must motivate people to action. They must be realistic. And they must reduce confusion about people's rights and responsibilities. All this illustrates that for me, an American lawyer accustomed to making certain assumptions about the role and purpose of law, this was a huge learning experience. I hope that we left something of value behind, but I also know how this work expanded my own personal horizons. It changed how I thought about how our system works. It forced me to think more deeply about how and why laws work. It forced me to listen more carefully. And it absolutely informed how I thought about something I worked on later, which was domestic implementation in a wide variety of country settings of international climate commitments. Because ultimately, when countries make such commitments, they must figure out a way to come home and deliver on those commitments. And too often, those commitments are on paper and don't get implemented. When there isn't a lot of experience delivering on domestic environmental promises, international obligations are not likely to fare any better. So I want to make one final point: future challenges. The people we worked with knew how effective American environmental protection had been. They knew the story of Pittsburgh, for example, although more than once when we raised that as an issue, that you can make change, they reminded me, sometimes just with gestures, of US affluence compared to what their economic situation was. Also, all of us assumed relative continuity between Republican and Democratic administrations. Environmental protection didn't stop when a different party took power. In the US, it was understood as a joint enterprise that spanned political parties. My international efforts started in the administration of George H.W. Bush. I couldn't imagine a more supportive bunch of people, and personally, I spent more time at the White House in that administration than at any of my time at EPA. For the most part, leaving aside the Gorsuch era and perhaps Bush 43 on climate change, there was in fact a general consensus, although differences of opinion on emphasis and how you go about it. Given the history of the past 2 years, this might be where we might have to do some patching up in future administrations. Reestablishing our credibility and restoring the money that is necessary to make that happen, to do the international work, as the world's environmental leader will be the challenge of the next administration. And before I end, I just want to note several people in the audience who were foundations of the International Office for many, many years, and I'm hoping during the Q&A that they will speak up and share a lot of their experience. The two people I see are Anna Phillips and Jane Metcalf. There may be others in the room. There may be others in the room who I just haven't recognized just now, but I think it can be a very rich conversation about what we can achieve. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. We'll now hear from Timothy Epp.
Thanks. I have been traveling. I think it's on. I have been traveling, engaging in international exchanges on behalf of EPA for approximately 15 years. And my experience reinforces what Ruth was saying, that EPA's views internationally are highly valued, frequently requested, and carefully considered. There was an international meeting that I attended in 2015 as an early part of a process that I'll talk about later on in my talk, that was a midterm review of the UN Environment Program's law program. And at that meeting, there were approximately 100 countries represented. I'd say fully 50% of them identified as their top concern, top need for capacity building or for development to be not international law, but environmental impact assessment. Another very large group identified law enforcement, environmental law enforcement, everything from inspections to how you present a case in court. Others identified the core pieces of writing laws and how you write them in a manner that are enforceable and effective. Others identified the building of institutions as what they are concerned about, how different institutions in a government interact, how the national interacts with the local. And for all of those things, they looked to EPA, to the US experience as a model to follow. Not necessarily the only one, but as a key one. And our reputation out there lives very large. That results in requests that often outpace EPA's ability to respond. Thus, I'm going to start by emphasizing some of the limitations that we need to keep in mind about EPA's role. First, there's the question of legal authority for EPA's engagement internationally. And here, one of the touchstones is a 1950s statute, the Casablanca Act, that gives the initiation and conclusion and then interpretation of international treaties and international law to the State Department. So we need to recognize EPA's role in our federal family is not that, because that is the State Department. Also, for our own engagement internationally, we look to our own domestic environmental statutes coupled with NEPA's education provision. And so our legal authority to do this really grows out of the same statutes that we're working on domestically. And then, of course, we need to keep in mind EPA's setting of priorities on a regular basis and how a particular engagement request fits in with those priorities, and a balancing of resources, the use of resources for international engagement when there are needs for example, domestic enforcement. And third limitation is, and this is clearly a practical one, there is lots of value in the engagement of other federal agencies. So the State Department, U.S. Trade Representative, Commerce, USAID. Let me give two examples from this last year of ways in which all of this comes together. First, I'm going to talk about an engagement last week in China. It was a bilateral exchange. General Counsel Matt Leopold was the first senior level appointee to visit China on behalf of EPA in this administration. He went to advance EPA's work under an MOU on environmental cooperation that we have with China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment. China, of course, is an important trading partner, and China has consistently sought EPA's experience over the years. Some of the folks in the audience here have been part of that exchange, and has sought our lessons learned as it has adopted and implemented its new environmental laws. And they have, over the last 5 years, I think, adopted somewhere above 10 new environmental laws. Last week, China's Ministry of Environment hosted an environmental law symposium in Nanjing, which is the lead province on implementing China's new soil pollution prevention and control law. So the focus of the conference was soil pollution, and EPA experts were there to talk about our experiences under RCRA. Matt Leopold, General Counsel, gave a keynote address on the role of rule of law as a fundamental pillar for effective implementation of environmental laws, including access to information, public participation, and accountability. And he identified how environmental law, rule of law, is key to preventing pollution, highlighting recent examples from both China and the United States. So here I'll pause and say as an aside, helping improve environmental rule of law in institutions in countries like China is key for multiple reasons. It can help prevent cross-border transport of pollution that may impact the U.S. at some point. Strong, effective environmental rule of law also levels the playing field for commerce and allows businesses to build compliance into their planning. More broadly, the U.S. State Department has observed in international engagements that unaddressed grievances lie at the root of many environmental concerns that provoke protest around the world. Many of these conflicts could be avoided if there were adequate stakeholder access to environmental information, public participation, and access to justice. So now let me turn to the next example of EPA's engagement, and that involves an international organization with the UN Environment Program. The United States and Uruguay led an international effort over the past year to reinvigorate and refocus the UN Environment Program's law program, also known as the Montevideo Program, which is now nearing the end of its 4th decade. I co-chaired a series of meetings to develop the governing document for the 5th decade-long law program, which was adopted by the UN Environment Program's governing body this past March at the UN Environment Assembly. The new 5th law program's purpose is to provide greater support for national governments. It is guided by the premise that effective, well-enforced national, local environmental laws are key to pollution prevention and lead to stronger economies and improved security. The U.S. led this effort to ensure Montevideo 5 would not lose sight of the need for strengthening environmental law at the national level, including the sharing of experiences, practical guidance, innovative tools, and, in particular, model laws. And here, on the margins of it, we gave as an example the Clean Fuels in Vehicles initiative from the past 15 years, as well as the current model lead paint law that the Global Alliance for Lead Paint, which EPA co-chairs and UNEP is a significant partner in, produced in the last couple of years. The new 5th law program also improves member state leadership and guidance to UNEP in implementing the program, situates it solidly within the government member state-led process, and gives direction for future UNEP action to promote environmental laws that are clearly defined, cost-effective, and achievable with verifiable and measurable results. I think this represents, or one can draw out of this, a model for future engagement. EPA's, and it can be found in the China example of bilateral relationships, and it can also be found in EPA's work with UNEP and voluntary partnerships such as the Global Alliance, Lead Paint Alliance, working on national laws. And one of the key things about this is that it draws on EPA's experience in advancing environmental protection domestically. We bring our experience to that, and it's welcomed. It provides a readily measurable metrics in terms of law changes that international donors increasingly require for new and renewed funding. It is nimble and can begin immediately with key partners, as evidenced in our bilateral work with China and the Lead Paints Alliance with UNEP. It is readily scalable and expandable to address other environmental protection issues, whether they relate to soils or air or water. And international partnerships and exchanges of this nature, working with UNEP, can address environmental concerns without the arduous treaty negotiation process involving many countries, and can take many years, and then are often left, once they're negotiated, with enforcement issues and implementation issues that still need to be addressed. So with that, I'll turn back over to you.
The issue a little bit with the early days in Central and Eastern Europe, and some comments on what we're doing today. And now we'll hear from Scott, who will fill in all the interim parts. Just kidding, Scott.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you, David. Good greetings, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you, part of this event. ELI is pleased and privileged to have a chance to be a co-sponsor of this event. I'll be sharing some thoughts, not so much from the ELI vantage point, although about half of our programmatic work is international in character, and I'll just give a little shout out to Mr. Zhou Liu over here to the left, who runs our China program, and we've got pretty significant engagement underway over there, kind of soup to nuts rule of law work from citizens groups to prosecutors and judges, and great opportunity, but also just a reflection of the incredible appetite that remains in the world for the learning from the U.S. experience. Good to be, I have to say, when I'm with a group like this and so many people that I know, there are two feelings that come to me. One is a sense of warmth. It's wonderful to see you all again. The second is a sense of fear that I have not returned calls or made other mistakes along the way. So I'd like to offer just a blanket apology for all my past failings. For my part, I thought I would do three things, just offer a brief reflection on the past of this environmental international work, offer a few thoughts on where we are in the present, and then think towards the future. My thinking towards the future will probably be primarily in the form of some questions that we should expect to face and need to reckon with. So, any reflection on the past of international work at a place like EPA, I think has to begin with a big thank you to the person who's really the father of international work at the agency, in my view, which is Mr. Bill Riley, sitting right over here. With Bill's leadership and the leadership of others, my reflection on the past is really just to recognize the incredible contributions of the United States government and EPA, in particular in advancing environmental quality around the world. The United States interventions and leaderships have not only raised the importance of preserving natural resources, but also helped build systems of laws and institutions to that end, has helped bend the trend line of exploitation and destruction from what it otherwise might have been. But the contributions even go beyond the environmental sphere. Our work with governments around the world around issues like citizen engagement in the environmental context has served as a leading edge for further democratization in a lot of the world with citizen involvement in the environmental context serving as an example of where citizens should be involved more generally. So these are really tremendous accomplishments. How did we come to it? Well, we were, of course, among the first to industrialize, and so we were also among the first to encounter the consequences of rapid industrialization, and we're forced really by our own calamity to figure things out. So we became the pioneers in environmental impact assessment. We became the pioneers in pollution control, environmental pioneers, period. And the incredible knowledge that we developed became the envy of the world and ultimately a key strategic foreign policy asset for the United States government. I would say that from the very beginning there was a dual purpose behind this work, partly self-interested, but also partly noble. From the self-interest standpoint, natural resource conflicts are necessarily destabilizing and present security concerns. We need security. The environment can also serve as a workable subject matter area for countries that are in conflict and needing to build the capacity for broader peace. So again, in the interest of security, we've used the environment as a wedge for broader peace. Economic self-interest has also been in the mix, both in terms of making sure that U.S. companies investing in environmental controls were not disadvantaged in the international marketplace, but also in terms of promoting the export of U.S. environmental technologies and services. And of course, there is the idea of protecting the domestic environment, and that pollution does not respect international boundaries. Their pollution is our pollution, so let's help them address their pollution. But I think beyond this, there was a noble purpose behind this work. We knew that what we had learned could help countries address their natural resource problems, and that economic progress, lifting people out of poverty, public health, all of these things depended to some degree on a healthy environment. So there was a helping hand dimension to this work, which was, in my view, a very good thing and a reflection of who we are as a people when we're operating at our best. So I would suggest this is our heritage in this space, and it's a very proud one, in my view. So where are we now? I would say we're in a period of retrenchment in many forms. There is downward pressure on environmental budgets, not just here, but all around the world. There is a general retreat away from internationalism and a renewed focus and sense of intensity around national self-interest. And there are some casualties that flow from this. Chief among them, I fear that the noble purpose basis for this work has been severely compromised. Perhaps even more challenging still, even the business case, the self-interested basis for this work is suffering because of the tendency by those who lean towards nationalism to also lean in the direction of treating the environment as an exaggerated concern. If one only looks inward, and if one discounts the environmental priority because the underlying concern is seen as inflated, then even a straight-up self-interested notion like promoting the export of environmental technology struggles for priority and profile. So it seems to me that we're in a challenging place at the moment for this work, and This is a problem. It's a problem because the world still desperately needs what we can bring to it. It's a problem because the benefits that redound to us from this work are just as present as they've ever been. It's a problem because despite the achievements of the past, our fixes have not kept pace with rapid development around the world, and certainly not with advancing problems like climate change. The Environmental Law Institute recently put out a report for UN Environment entitled Environmental Rule of Law First Global Assessment. This was put out, I think, at the end of January. If you haven't seen it, I commend it to your reading. The study makes a lot of observations, but concludes ultimately that although a lot of progress has been made around the world in developing environmental laws and institutions, ineffective implementation is still fairly rampant with increasingly grave consequences. And we are not doing well against some key indicators of environmental health. Despite all of the focus in recent years over deforestation and wetlands lost, we have not yet turned the tide on those issues. And loss of habitat and other factors have put us in an extremely vulnerable place with respect to biodiversity, with fears now being expressed about the collapse of entire species from a changing climate alone. So this is not a good moment for retrenchment, and yet we are retrenched. Maybe it's the optimist in me, or maybe it's simply because I believe that we'll come to see that we lack no other choice, but I think we'll find our way back to significant international environmental engagement. When we get there, some important questions will remain, and let me frame just a few of those. First, in the past, we have rightly seen ourselves as the world's teacher when it comes to the environment. But while we may be currently more or less running in place, others are running forward on important issues, like catalyzing the circular economy, like internalizing the costs of ecosystem services and environmental choices and decisions. And one question for the international apparatus of an agency like EPA will be whether we're ready to learn rather than just teach. Second, how will we reckon with the likelihood of sustained downward pressure on federal budgets? Foreign policy work tends to be inherently governmental, deeply dependent on government labor, and therefore disproportionately affected by budget cuts because personnel costs run higher than contract costs. How will we finance this work going forward? Relatedly, can government be more efficient in how it does this work? I don't think we've yet arrived in terms of the bridge work within and between agencies and getting international work done. There is still a tendency to hold things close and build internal expertise rather than harness resources that already exist elsewhere. The dynamics are complicated, I know, but the combination of control behaviors and free agency are a big problem in this space. Relatedly, again, can the private sector play a more significant role in advancing environmental objectives around the world? What does the adoption of sustainability measures by multinational companies add to this equation? What does supply chain management, which is effectively private sector systems of regulation, bring to this? Can or should the public-private interface be more relevant to the environmental foreign policy of this country? Finally, how will we reckon with the coming data tsunami as low-cost sensors, drone technology, and satellite sensing, all assisted by artificial intelligence, give us real-time information and narratives on natural resource loss, pollution, and the movement of environmental contraband? What will we do when we can see much, much more clearly what is happening around us and to us? Perhaps it's then that we'll return to the hard work of stitching together tools and actors around the world to correct an image that we cannot ignore. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
I'm going to look forward to their answers to those questions. And maybe Dale will give us some. Dale Medeiros.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be here. Thanks to Amanda and Ingrid and everyone on this panel for allowing me to be here. I'd also like to say thanks to Alan Hecht, who passed away on Friday. I don't think I'd be on this panel if it wasn't for Alan's help and all the support that he gave to me when I was at EPA. I'd like to share with you just very shortly the perspectives of the cities and how they can engage internationally, with the hope that it might inform some of EPA's future work as it looks ahead. Lots of attention is being placed on cities for obvious reasons, particularly in the context of climate change. Cities are the largest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. They're also subject to being the victims of the effects of climate change. There's also EPA's substantial role in cities and metropolitan sustainability issues, the budget, the legal authority for things like Superfund, brownfields, environmental justice, water infrastructure, all support a very robust domestic agenda. And as the attention of the world focuses on cities, the question then emerges, how do cities collaborate? What do they do other than just meet in event-based contexts? And I'd like to give some insight into ways in which that might be addressed. Part of the problem with global international work at the local level is frankly that it's seen as niche, it's seen as boutique and marginal. In the most toxic contexts, it's seen as wasteful, and that hurts. I think it's sad for all of us to see the headlines in the papers about a junket, a boondoggle, because we know that's not the case. We know this work is really important. And so what I think we all aspire to do is make the work internationally of cities, also the agency, mainstream. Certainly not just abroad, but with respect to Flint, Michigan, or to Huntington, West Virginia. And I think that there are ways that we can discuss about how to do that. Just very shortly, I work for a regional council of governments, 13 local authorities in Northern Virginia. We're an agency of the Commonwealth of Virginia. It's everything in size from Fairfax County, 1,500,000, to town of Dumfries. So my board is comprised of the mayors, the county commissioners, the councilors of these towns. And they have expectations about clean drinking water, about clean air, about smart cities, about renewable energy. And we're growing faster in 37 states. We're a globally engaged region. Fun fact is that we're home to a vast array of data centers. It's estimated that 70% of the world's internet traffic passes through the data centers of Western Fairfax, Eastern Loudoun, which is why we have lured companies like Amazon. It's an issue that be fun to address a little bit later at the close of my remarks. So the way in which we have elected to work internationally is premised on 3 core points that I'd like to share with you. The first is the unilateral transfers of lessons, and the operative term is unilateral. It's about ways in which we take innovations, policy and technical, from other countries and apply them that lead to outcomes that help cities like Alexandria, Arlington County, Falls Church, all of our members, help them environmentally, economically, and socially. And that's fundamental. The second core point is that we prioritize the numbers of countries with which we work. That's important so that we stay focused on the outcomes and stay strategic. We have a filter that we use. I'll discuss very shortly about how that's applied. But it's important for us to make this work so that we say international works and that it's not a distraction. The third key point is that when you're dealing with micro cogeneration, passive house design technologies, green infrastructure, TMDLs, these are very complex issues, and you need support, you need partnerships, which I think is a pretty important part of the agency's work. And so we have reached out to our commercial, our governmental, also to our academic and scientific partners. Let me just elaborate really quickly about the 3 points. With respect to the first one, unilateral transfers of lessons, the arrow flows from abroad to Northern Virginia. And there are two real critical benefits to that. The day job of wastewater treatment engineer at Alexandria Renew, the job of an energy planner in Arlington County, the day job of a transportation planner in Loudoun County, it's to improve transportation, to alleviate congestion, to improve water quality in the Potomac, to address TMDLs. When we take the knowledge, the innovations from abroad and apply it locally in the United States, we help these guys. They don't see necessarily international work as a distraction, they see it as a complement to their work. The second, I think, more intangible benefit of having that arrow pointed from abroad to Northern Virginia is that as great as the reputation of EPA is abroad, the image in the United States right now is sort of suffering. And there's this notion of American exceptionalism that we sort of have to address and we suffer from. And I think that when we reach out to the world and we say, we want to learn from you, we demonstrate a humility that softens those edges of American exceptionalism. We tell the world, look, we want to take ownership of some of the problems to which we've contributed, and all of them, but we want to take ownership of them, and we want to learn from you, critical country A, critical country B. With respect to the second point, the filter that we use, it's imperfect, but it's been working for us so far. We use economic interconnectedness, mostly in the form of foreign direct investment data at the state level and trade. And what we find is that the countries that are invested in us tend to be the countries that also offer us a lot of innovations. They tend to be the Netherlands, the Germanys, the Switzerlands, the Frances, and the Canadas. And these are also institutions that have very solid, robust working relationships with EPA at the governmental level. They have research institutions with which our research institutions collaborate. So it helps us apply this. Again, it's imperfect. It doesn't work as ideally as we'd like, but it's a start. The third point, the partnerships with our governmental, our commercial, our civil society, our research, our scientific institutions, is premised on where our business model of working internationally converges with theirs. We're not telling them they have to dismiss their international work. First of all, we don't have the authority. We function more or less as a think tank. We simply say, we want to work with you in this context, and what we want to be able to do is where you, George Mason University, have Fulbright fellows who have worked in Switzerland on passive housing design standards, we want to work with your faculty to figure out how we can apply it here in Leesburg. We have an interesting project which I can elaborate later, which might be useful for EPA's International Science and Technology Agreement. It's the American Geophysical Union and also faculty at George Mason University. We've got the support of hydrologists, 2 civil engineers, a meteorologist to help us figure out stormwater modeling in light of the precipitation models that tell us what's going to happen over the next 10, 15 years, and then figure out how that can be used to bridge the gray and the green infrastructure conversation so that we avoid the next generation of Ellicott cities. Why that's useful is because it's unusual for international science and technology collaboration to steer away from sort of basic research. This offers a new opportunity for cross-national global science and technology research that's applied at the local level. I have a lot of slides, but I'll just highlight quickly how this has been at work in restorations of places like 4 Mile Run. The Community Energy Plan of Arlington County was grounded in some of the work that we started with Germany. It's worked. An important point with respect to our methodology also is that we know that this is not just add water and stir. We know that this is a complex process, that this is long-term, and it requires lots and lots of conversations. And we've stayed sensitive to the process of making sure that what we take is suitably adopted to this unique regulatory, legal, environmental, technical, cultural landscape called the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I think that's really important to bear in mind. So in closing, just 3 points that I'd like to share with you is that our work has sustained some modest, actually pretty good political support, not just from within our board, but also at the state level and also at the federal level. Congressman Connolly is our former chairman, worked with us on a lot of these issues before he left Fairfax County to become a member of Congress. Congressman Beyer, of course, is a former US diplomat in Bern, has helped us a lot on these activities. Senator Kane, when he was governor, actually signed an agreement with the German Federal Ministry of Environment that we wrote for him that co-launched the Transatlantic Climate Bridge. And so we see this also, yes, you could argue Northern Virginia is quite blue politically. We think that this has an appetite also to be a blue-red divide when it's done strategically and when it's done thoughtfully. Second closing point is that we've had success not just in the environmental and sustainability field, but also in other areas. We're starting to reach out now with our community college system to look at ways in which the German workforce and training systems that have worked so well abroad could be applied to the United States. Actually ties into the point that I made earlier, because one of the few points that President Trump could agree with Chancellor Merkel February before last was the need to work together on workforce training. And then finally, this work is grounded in very solid historical precedents. This isn't something that's just been around for 10, 15, 20, 25 years. This goes back decades, if not centuries. When you look to the origins of the National Park Service and Mather, he was going to Switzerland to look at inspiration for natural resource management practices. Same thing with Gifford Pinchot, who spent years in France and in Germany looking at forestry management practices that he took back and applied in the United States. The whole history of Social Security, the whole history even of phenomenal stories like the growth and the origins of the NAACP, is all grounded in this business model. And it'd be wonderful to see how this could be ensconced further into the future work of EPA. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dale. I want to thank all the panelists at this point that were so good on time. And we did that deliberately. I didn't even have to stand up and crack the hammer. We did that on purpose to hopefully take advantage of those of you in the room with questions and to get a dialogue going. And so while you're thinking about your questions, I'm going to first ask the panel, since you were so good on time, if anyone wanted to comment on anybody else's panel or statement or answer any of Scott's questions. I did see a question out in the audience. I see a couple, so we'll go there. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jinjin.
Good morning. I'm Timothy Epp. You mentioned tribal governments, and I just was curious about if we could elaborate on the relationship of tribal governments in the U.S. and indigenous nations outside of the U.S. in terms of the role for EPA in that. I'm a former tribal chairman. I've worked with EPA in our area on issues, a variety of different issues, but I've also had experience in the international arena, working on climate change issues at the various COPs over the last several years and other places. And I'm just, this is one area that I'd sort of like to understand better how EPA thinks about that and relates to these issues. I know that the native office at EPA used to be in the water division and got moved to the international division. And that was partly because we understand that the tribes are sovereign nations, and we wanted to sort of have that relationship recognized. But I just wondered if you could talk about that a little.
Thank you for that question. I'm actually going to open it up to the panel here very soon because I actually did not mention tribal governments. It's not been my area of expertise or one of the areas that I've worked in heavily, except to the extent that we speak to tribal or native issues, indigenous issues in the international context, often through the lens of access to information, public participation, and access to remedy and redress. Access to justice. And that I earlier made the observation about the State Department's observation regarding the importance of those things as a touchstone in international contexts, and the observation that greater access to those may reduce some of the conflicts that we've seen internationally. The State Department has made that observation specifically in the context of the killing of environmental defenders who are often indigenous populations. But with that lens on the international side, I know that Scott here was key in the International and Tribal Relations Office, and whether others here might have a perspective as well. So,
sounds like an invitation. I guess a couple of observations. One is maybe the first one is another question, which is it'd be good to hear your thoughts on whether you think the change that was undertaken at the beginning of the Obama administration to move the tribal programs into the Office of International Affairs has been a good thing for the tribes. I think that was part of the objective, for sure. But it'd be good to truth test that to some degree. So my sense is that the relationship between the United States government and tribal governments emerges kind of in a comparative way in the international sphere. I don't know that EPA has historically taken it upon itself to try to tend to the bridge work between other governments and their indigenous peoples, or has played a convening role in more generally bringing networks of indigenous peoples together around the world. That's probably partly a reflection of the challenges that are embedded in our own political context. The complications that the U.S. government has always had relative to states when it comes to the tribes, and the difficulty that the U.S. government has always had finding a clear voice on these issues. But perhaps this is a space where the United States could offer more meaningful leadership, particularly if we thought we were doing something right in this realm, and you'd be a better judge of that than I.
Well, I would address that just briefly in that in 2006, the EPA Indigenous Office, working with Environment Canada and the Mexican Ministry of the Environment, raised money and brought a convening of indigenous people for the healing of Mother Earth together. We met down in Palenque in the state of Chiapas in Mexico. We had 50 representatives from indigenous people in Canada, from the US, and from Mexico. And we ran the meeting ourselves, but we had the support. And so EPA played a role in convening this group that then came up with a paper came out of that, which it started out as the Charter of Palenque, but after the committee got done with it, it was the message of the living spirit from the convening of indigenous people for the healing of Mother Earth at the traditional territory of the Maya. So you no longer really need to read the whole paper to understand what it's all about. But this is a very important paper in the indigenous world that has helped us a lot. And it's a role that EPA played. And so I would say that, and it was right around the similar time that the office was moving. Carol Jorgensen was the one that was working on that and helped with both this meeting and also with that move. So from my experience as a leader, and I'm now the executive director of the United Tribes of Michigan, so I work with all 12 tribes in the state, and we work closely with Region 5 and EPA, but we're always aware of this international element because we're right on the border with Canada, and we work with our relatives, the First Nations of Canada, right across the water. So there is a role there, and I feel that office being in this focus on international is really important to us. So I would say, yes, I feel good about what had happened there, but I'm also trying to figure out where we go from here. When we're talking about where does the EPA going to be? Well, this is one of those things that I would like to see more emphasis on, and I'd like to see it thought through a little more in terms of how that's the future EPA is formed.
Also put a plug in for the panel that's going to take place after this panel on the relationship with states and tribes. I also want to commend Tim for mentioning the impact on human rights defenders and environmental defenders. The context of our giving capacity building is also a context of currently of closing civil society space, and the message of the importance of civic engagement and public participation is an important one for EPA to be sending as we work in countries that aren't necessarily democratizing.
Thanks, David. So I'm wondering if we could return to a theme that I believe a number of you touched on, which is the issue of the role of public-private partnerships and the private sector's responsibility and advocacy and movement in the sustainability space more generally. As we look at the dynamics today and going forward, I was interested in Dale's comment. I've spent 25 years trying to advocate for the virtues of private sector governance in this space, including the data center area, which is an interesting microcosm potentially, given the breadth of the expansion of the cloud and the data center infrastructure globally. But more generally, I'd be interested in your perspectives on what the role is today and going forward of a more expansive view of public-private partnerships, and particularly leveraging private sector initiatives, multinational initiatives, to drive improvement in this space.
Going way back in history, but I mentioned in my remarks that one of the first important issues I worked on in Poland, and I think maybe David worked on in what was then Czechoslovakia before it split, was that they were very eager, the governments were eager to take these nationally owned firms, it was obviously a socialist economy, and spin them off, sell them off, and that many of the investors came in with the experience of having gone through, for example, Superfund responsibilities in the United States, and although none of these countries had those, had even begun to address those issues, there was already the idea that they would eventually be part of the European Union and they would have to conform up their laws, and so they were raising these anticipatorily, these issues in these negotiations. And the reason for that convoluted story is because it actually significantly raised the profile and prestige of the Environment Ministry, because we brokered an MOU between the Privatization Ministry and the Environment Ministry, in which the Environment Ministry, well, because there was such a difference in their prestige, it was the Privatization Ministry that was paramount, but they incorporated a unit drawn from the Environment Ministry into the Privatization Ministry to help them handle these issues and help them negotiate their way out of these problems. And that was a major event in kind of raising the profile and importance of the Environment Ministry to the main event in Poland then, which was getting the economy moving and getting these industries functioning, as in the Western sense of functioning.
I think that we should move straight down the line here, because I think our talks will dovetail in the way that they did in the first panel. So I'd also like to speak to that from the perspective of the Global Alliance to Eliminate Lead Paint that I mentioned earlier. So many people in the room might think of that issue as, oh, that's such a passé issue. We solved that issue back in the 70s. But the fact is that most of the countries in the world actually do not have laws on lead paint. And the Global Alliance is itself a co-chaired or chaired by the United States, but has the partnerships with other countries, including Germany and others from Europe, as well as key industry partners. So some of the leading manufacturer coalitions of paint pigment manufacturers are a party to that, because they have no interest in there being lead paint anymore. They've solved this problem as far as a technological issue goes. It's truly an issue of getting uniform laws around the world on the subject. And Our Commerce Department is involved in our work on it. They view it as a great example for working with countries in Central Asia on working together on what is essentially a commercial law from their perspective, with significant public health impacts. And there's a medical doctor, Dr. Trisani, from the New York University that has estimated the annualized cost of the damage to children around the world right now. The annualized cost is close to $1 trillion as a result of exposure to lead. And so, this is a significant public health issue, and it's one that we have a partnership that is a public-private partnership.
That there are some kind of manageable, kind of bite-sized pieces of this equation, and then there are some kind of grand ideas out there in this space. On the bite-size side of things, most multinational companies have realized that they ultimately benefit from the presence of rule of law in the environmental context, and we have a fair number of companies that are working with us in China, in part to build rule of law because it's a normalizing presence in the international marketplace and ensures the same measure of internalization of environmental costs. It's a little difficult to tell exactly where this is going, but I think there's a pretty good chance that we're going to see a coalition of companies offering to provide training to inspectors, Chinese governmental inspectors, so they know what to look for. They know what a state-of-the-art control regime looks like, and they have some sense of what the absence of one looks like. So this is work that we're doing at ELI, but it's work that could be done in a bigger and grander way with the wind of the federal government at its back. On the sort of bigger idea side of things, a really intriguing question is whether there's any ability to stitch together these supply chain management systems that are establishing normative environmental expectations and then policing them across their supply chain in a way that could either augment the presence of government efforts in the countries where those operations are taking place, or possibly compensate for government failure in those places. And one of the learnings from our work in this area is that when it comes to building the capacity of governments, it's not always a lasting thing, unfortunately. There's a give and take from the political process in countries that can essentially render meaningless some of those investments. So that it's not a guarantee that the capacity we're building is going to be there for the long haul. So if you had the private sector in a complementary way, and particularly if it was possible to do it in an organized or coherent way, creating a pressurized environment around environmental performance around the world, that could be a very significant assist in meeting our environmental objectives. But there are antitrust issues and all sorts of other things that complicate the mechanics of that, but that doesn't mean we should give up on it. I think there's really an intriguing notion present there.
I wish I could give you a better answer than this conversation has just started in the context of the data centers. I think IPCC reported, and don't quote me on this, it was something like 2% of greenhouse gas emissions are directly related to data centers, and the growth is expected to be exponential, doubling over the next 5-10 years. We see the demand for renewable energies from these firms like Amazon, Facebook that are coming in to our region. The data centers are huge energy hogs. The other opportunity that we see, speaking from a cross-national lesson learning context, is that the data centers are in the headlights of a tsunami of development that's going to occur as the Silver Line goes out past the airport. And so we see opportunities for heat conveyance from the data centers, drawing from lessons in which heat has been conveyed from data centers into district energy systems in cities like Darmstadt or Frankfurt. So we're just starting now a conversation, literally just now, about how we could draw those lessons and make the development that's going to take place out there more sustainable from an energy perspective.
We have about 5 to 10 minutes, and so I'm going to take 3 questions. Here, because you were early, and I want to do one in the back just to bring it back, and then, sorry about that. Go ahead. You have the mic, that's how you get chosen.
Yeah. There is a group of sort of stealth international ambassadors for EPA, and those are called scientists. And they travel all over the world, and they give talks, and they meet other international scientists, and they educate about EPA. I mean, there's no EPA scientist that doesn't start their talk without saying something about where they're from and what EPA is. So I'm just wondering what you feel is the scientist's role in international context.
This is for Ruth, but also for the rest of the panel. In the late 80s, I spent a week without heat in Białowieża in Poland, writing environmental clauses for what was to become the new Polish constitution after the Jaruzelski government fell, which it had not done yet. It was an extraordinary experience. They did not even have a deed registry in Poland, and they were talking about creating environmental rights and trading them. Right? A lot has happened since then, but in the last 5 years, Poland has lurched to the right and pretty far away from some aspects of the rule of law, like a lot of the rest of the world. And my question is, how much of what you all did is sticking, and what are the mechanisms to keep it in place as this process plays out? We've got the question here, but I'm interested in Poland.
Hi, my name is Jake Swanson. I'm a senior at American University, and I'm also an intern at the European Union delegation to the U.S. My question is, so basically a lot of the collaboration that goes on between the EPA and foreign countries is exchange of information, and the European Commission Director General for the Environment just visited the EPA laboratory in Triangle Park in February. And so my question is, how can the EPA and international countries improve collaboration that's more than exchanging information? And how can the EPA and other countries build up these programs? Thank you.
Okay, just very fast.
Let me just say,
Yeah.
we'll go down the path, respond to the question, and any last comments you want to make.
Okay. Just on the science issue, you know probably better than I do that during the whole Soviet period, it was track 2, it was scientists talking to scientists that established incredible levels of communication that were used later. For example, when the Soviet Union broke down and there was this whole issue of loose nukes, and you know those forms of communication were incredibly instrumental in helping solve what could have been a really major problem. So yeah, they're informal ambassadors of huge importance. On what's sticking, well, you remember they do have a terrible government right now in Poland, but there was 25 years of real progress. I can tell you I'll try to truncate this story. In 2008, I lived in Poland a second time, and I set up a task force that was to help the climate ambassador, that actually helped get them to appoint a climate ambassador, because they were hosting for the first time a COP in Poznan. And I hired a staff of people, young people who'd never worked on climate change. One of the people I hired, Kasia Snyder, who married an American, that's why it's Snyder, it's really Romanska. went to work in the Environment Ministry when she was their climate person, or leading their climate group. She was doing such an incredible job that when in the build-up to Paris, the European Union asked her to join the EU negotiating. But then the new government came in and Kasia was bounced. She was told to beat it. So she didn't participate in Paris. The reason I'm telling this story is because you know that Poland recently hosted a COP in Katowice. The new environment minister sought out Kasia and brought her back to help him prepare and run the COP. So, you know, I don't know what that tells you generally about what's going on in Poland, but, you know, this guy realized that he didn't have the skills, that there was a Polish person with the skills, and he brought her back. And she's continuing, now that the COP is over, to work for them remotely. She actually lives these days in Pittsburgh because her American husband wanted to come back to the United States. It's just a data point, but it may tell you something about where things are going.
I also think it tells you that often the investment is in institutions and people less than in the text.
Yeah.
So I didn't speak to the science side of EPA, which of course is incredibly important, probably far more important than the law side. All of our statutes are underpinned by an expectation that the decisions that we make are based on sound science. And so my apologies for having been so law-focused as a lawyer. But without a doubt, you've pointed to one of our most important ambassadors, as you say, the scientists who, both in science conferences as well as governmental exchange meetings, do that work of sharing data and establish EPA's credibility on the science, on the underlying data. So thank you for bringing that up, and my apologies. On the Eastern European, one of the things that I can speak to is that the regional environmental centers, the RECs, that were set up during that time period are still ongoing and are a key piece of the infrastructure that we relate to, the Global Alliance for Elimination of Lead Paint. The work that we're doing in Central Asia is done in some manner coordinated with the relevant RECs there and with the State Department's interface with them. And then I think the science question also spoke to the other question about collaboration between scientists and our labs. That is a central and very important piece of what EPA does and will be going forward, I truly believe. And I unfortunately can't speak to it much, but since you identified yourself as a student, I'll make the pitch that if you want to do international law in such a way as traveling to exotic places, sitting in hotels and conference centers and working with diplomats, then please go to the State Department. If you want to work with country representatives on the laws that matter to them, come work for EPA.
Here, here.
I don't know that I have much to add to the question about scientists, but yes, of course. Knowledge transfer in the broadest possible sense is what's desired and needed, and we have a lot to share, both in terms of the governance mechanics, but also the technical dimensions to this work, and this is highly technical work at the end of the day, so absolutely yes. In terms of what is sticking, and in particular in the rule of law context, I've actually worried about this a lot through the years because of the slippage that you can see in a number of settings. And while I guess in theory pretty much anything is capable of being unraveled by a government that is of a mind to do that, from the judiciary to all the key institutions of government, perhaps the things that are most likely to be lasting are the things that are hardest to dial back. So the inroads that we've been able to make in various places on transparency initiatives, TRI-like systems, where information is assured of finding its way into the public domain, accessible to the public. Those seem to have some lasting power, and they're a little bit difficult. It's hard to put the genie back in the bottle on that kind of thing. Similarly, public engagement, the creation of the citizen rights. What's that?
30 seconds. I just
30 seconds?
got a technical bit of information, so 30
Okay.
seconds so we have a little time for Dale. Sorry.
The last piece might be public integrity related systems, kind of systems approaches. The establishment of auditors general or IG-like systems so that it's a little bit more difficult for governments to engage in that kind of tinkering. There are lots of examples about collaboration that go well beyond information exchange, and I can share those with you at the break.
Dale? Sorry about that, but go ahead.
Really
Dale.
quickly, the extent to which the 4 points that the first question raised converge, EPA, international, science, and local, or in my case, local, sorry, that was what I introduced. There's a great program that I referenced. It's the American Geophysical Union's Thriving Earth Exchange. It takes the AGU scientific membership that aspires voluntarily to work at the local level. And in 4 weeks, we'll be in Stuttgart, Germany, looking at ways in which faculty from George Mason University can work with their counterparts at the University of Stuttgart to figure out ways in which that region's 80-year history with green infrastructure and urban heat island mitigation and stormwater modeling could be applied to the benefit of our own. So I think that that would be the first step. The second is that just down the road from us, there's the American Society of Civil Engineers. The Director of International Programs and Sustainability Programs wears both hats. He's a friend. And it would be great to encourage him to develop an international plan for ASCE so that maybe the report card could be informed by best practices abroad and then get the EPA scientists to help that. That's a target-rich environment and something that would bring in measurable benefits, I think, to us nationally on everything from grid renewal to renewable energy to roads to dams, water infrastructure. And then in response to the third question, I think it would be great if the EU could support a text project that builds on this lesson learning from abroad so that we get results in wastewater treatment or stormwater modeling or climate modeling. That's it.
Thank you. And before I give up the mic, I want to thank everybody and thank this panel. I particularly want to thank Bill Riley. You won't remember this, but some of what we discussed here is a bit about having humility and taking information from different sources. And when Bill led the first EPA delegation to Central and Eastern Europe and to Czechoslovakia, my wife and I were junior lawyers, very junior lawyers, and he and his team still treated us with respect and let us participate in the different processes, and I'll forever be grateful. It was a great learning experience, and one of the reasons to do this work is that we learn mutually, as Dale and others pointed out, and I hope you all learned as much from this session as I did. We had to cut it off a little short because technology is going to have this wall disappear from us, so we can get back. And we'll go back to Amanda.
Yeah, so thank you all so much.